fundamentally broken? Back in the 17th century, one of the most powerful voices in English criticism passionately believed it was, and believe me, he wasn't quiet about it. All right, so who was this guy? Meet Thomas Reimer. He lived from 1641 to 1713, and he was an English critic, historian, and even a playwright who basically took it upon himself to bring some law and order to the English stage. Now, to get Reimer, you really have to get his time. He was living during the Restoration, an era that was all about reestablishing control and reason after the total chaos of the English Civil War. And this wasn't just about politics, it was a huge cultural thing. Reimer looked at the theater and saw that same wild, untamed energy, and he was convinced it needed a strict set of rules to turn it into a serious, moral art form. The big idea driving him was called neoclassical criticism. This was a movement sweeping through Europe that looked back to the ancient Greeks and Romans as the ultimate masters of art. For Reimer, their plays weren't just inspiration. They were like a perfect, logical blueprint for how a play had to be made. This wasn't just his preference. He saw it as the one and only correct way. So what were these rules exactly? Let's break down the rigid, specific principles that Reimer was absolutely convinced every single great play had to follow. No exceptions. Okay, the foundation of his whole system was something called the three unities. First up, unity of time. The play's entire story had to happen within about 24 hours. Simple. Second, unity of place. No jet setting across the country. The action has to stay in one single spot. And third, unity of action. You get one main plot, and that's it. No messy subplots to distract everyone. For Reimer, this was the only way to make a play feel realistic and coherent. But for Reimer, it went way deeper than just structure. He was convinced that tragedy had a moral duty. For one, characters had to follow decorum, which just means a king always has to act like a king, a servant like a servant, and so on. They had to stay in their lane. And yeah, you could have emotions like pity and fear, but they had to be reasonable, not just cheap sensationalist tricks. The main point for Reimer was that art had a job to do, to teach you something and make society better. So, what happens when you take this incredibly strict rulebook and try to judge the wild, sprawling genius of William Shakespeare? Well, this is where the fireworks really start, especially with Reimer's infamous takedown of King Lear. And wow, Reimer did not hold back. He famously ripped into King Lear, calling it a disorganized mess. He argued that it completely fails to teach a clear moral lesson. The good guys suffer just as much as the bad guys. And that brutal ending, to him, it was totally senseless. He basically saw it as a violation of every single rule a good tragedy should follow. This really just lays out the fundamental clash, doesn't it? Where we see dramatic power. Reimer just saw pure chaos. He hated the violence, the way the family just disintegrates, and he argued the tragic moments weren't even properly justified. He actually thought all this chaos would push an audience away instead of pulling them in. He wanted a neat, tidy tragedy with a clear moral at the end. And well, Shakespeare gave him a thunderstorm. But here's a fascinating twist to this whole story. Reimer wasn't just some critic yelling from the sidelines. Nope. He was also a playwright who was determined to put his theories into practice on an actual stage. So he wrote these hugely influential books of criticism, like A Short View of Tragedy, where he laid out all his ideas. But he also wrote his own plays, like The Tragedy of the Duke of Guise and The Royal Convert. This was his chance to put his money where his mouth was and show everyone how it should be done. And his plays were, well, they were exactly what you'd expect. They're all about moral dilemmas, the classic conflict between love and duty, and powerful people facing tough choices. This was his big shot at creating the kind of structured, moral, and instructive drama he thought was totally missing from the English stage. So, how do we look back on Thomas Reimer today? Is he just a footnote in history? You know, the guy who famously got Shakespeare wrong? Turns out, it's a little more complicated than that. While it's really easy to poke fun at him for being so rigid, his work was actually incredibly important. His constant focus on structure and morality forced everyone to have a serious conversation about what theater should even be. In a time of some pretty wild and messy plays, he fought for the idea that drama could be a high art form. He absolutely helped elevate the standards for generations of playwrights, even if we've pretty much thrown out his specific formula. And that leaves us with this huge, timeless question that goes way beyond the 17th century. What is art really for? Is its job to teach us a lesson to make us better people? Or is it supposed to just show us life as it is? Beautiful, chaotic, and often really messy. Thomas Reimer was absolutely sure he knew the answer, but more than 300 years later, that's a debate we're all still having.
All right, let's get into it. Today, we are talking about one of the most brilliant, most scandalous, and frankly, most contradictory figures in all of English literature, John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester. This was a man who was equal parts genius poet and infamous party animal, living a life that burned incredibly bright and incredibly fast back in the 17th century. And yeah, that quote pretty much says it all, doesn't it? Rochester's voice is just so cynical, so sharp, and so brutally honest about what it means to be human, including himself. It's this challenging, kind of dark worldview that makes him so compelling. So let's unpack the man behind these wild words. So first things first, let's talk about the man himself, the Wicked Earl. The thing you have to understand about Rochester is that his whole life was one giant paradox. He was a man who is completely at war with himself, and this inner battle is really the key to understanding, well, everything about him, his life, his writing, all of it. And you can really see those two warring sides of him laid out perfectly here. On the one hand, you've got the aristocrat, born into a fancy family, gets a top-tier education at Oxford, becomes a celebrated courtier in King Charles II's inner circle. But on the other hand, you have the complete opposite, the libertine, a guy totally consumed by a lifestyle of excess, whose absolutely scandalous behavior constantly overshadowed his genius. And the crazy part is, these weren't two separate lives. They were always tangled up, feeding off and fighting each other. His incredible intellect just made his partying more cynical, and his scandalous life gave his poetry that raw, unfiltered edge. So you have to ask yourself, how does a guy like this even exist, let alone become famous? Well, to get the man, you've got to get the time he lived in. We have to understand the wild, chaotic stage on which he played out his life, Restoration England. The Restoration period was basically a massive cultural explosion. I mean, think about it. After years of super stern, restrictive Puritan rule, where everything fun was banned, England just burst back to life under King Charles II. The court became this hotbed of artistic freedom, scientific discovery, and, well, a whole lot of social license. It was an environment of constant tension between acting proper and total personal freedom, which made it the perfect chaotic playground for a mind like Rochester's. And in this world of wild excess and, let's be honest, hypocrisy, Rochester didn't just join the party, he took notes. He found his greatest weapon in his pen, and he used it not just to write poems, but to dissect the society around him with a surgical and often really brutal precision. And nothing, I mean nothing, shows off his provocative style better than one of his most infamous works, Sodom. This thing was like a satirical atom bomb. It paints a picture of a society completely given over to every kind of debauchery you can imagine. It was a direct, shocking critique of the hedonism he saw all around him. This wasn't just edgy, it was literary dynamite. So scandalous, in fact, that it was banned for centuries and only passed around in secret. What made Sodom so unbelievably radical was how unflinching and explicit it was. Rochester basically weaponized shock value. By pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable to write about, he forced his readers to confront the hypocrisy of a society that preached virtue while practicing, well, the exact opposite. So the key here is, the poem wasn't just for shock's sake. It was him holding up a mirror to the court's own wild behavior. He also turned that same sharp wit to the stage. In his comedy, The Relapse, he zeroes in on the rich and powerful through this absolutely unforgettable character, Lord Foppington. This is a guy so obsessed with his looks and his status that he has these elaborate rituals just for getting dressed. Through this ridiculous character, Rochester brilliantly satirizes the superficiality, the obsession with fashion, and the absurd social games that defined high society. Sure, it's a comedy, but it has a biting social critique woven through every single line. But Rochester's critiques went way deeper than just poking fun at the upper class. He started to question the very foundations of human nature itself, and the new Enlightenment ideals that were just starting to take shape. And this, right here, is the core philosophical question that just seemed to haunt him. What really drives us as people? Is it our intellect, our logic, our so-called reason? Or is it something way more primal, something rooted in our passions and our animal instincts? In what is probably his masterpiece, A Solder Against Reason and Mankind, he makes his argument crystal clear. He basically says human reason is a fraud. It's a useless guide that just leads us astray. And then he controversially suggests that it's actually our animal instincts, our passions, that are the more honest and reliable guides to life. Now, this was a direct attack on the growing Enlightenment belief in the power of rational thought, an idea championed by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes. Rochester was having none of it. So where does that leave him today? What do we make of all this? For centuries, really, his scandalous reputation was all anyone remembered. But as we look back now, a much more complex, much more brilliant picture starts to emerge. And his legacy is, well, it's complicated. As you can see here, during his own lifetime, his shocking behavior completely eclipsed his talent. But today, we see him differently. We see a man who perfectly embodied all the tensions and complexities of his era. We see how he used that bold, provocative language to attack hypocrisy head on, exploring the human condition with a brutal honesty that few could match. And in doing that, he ended up influencing generations of writers who also wanted to challenge the status quo. He was so much more than just a rake. He was a revolutionary poet. He died at just 33 years old, his body completely ravaged by his lifestyle. And his life, short as it was, forces us to ask a really tough question. Rochester chose to burn with this astonishing, self-destructive brilliance. It was a short, dazzling flare in the darkness, leaving us all to wonder, is it better to burn that brightly for just a moment? Or is it better to last for an age?
Today, we're going to crack open a book that's not just a book. It's basically a time machine. We're about to meet a man whose secret diary, written over 350 years ago, gives us this incredibly raw and honest window into a world that's completely vanished. I mean, really think about that for a second. We all know the dates, right? We know the names of kings, and we know about the big battles. But what did it actually feel like to walk down the street back then? What were people's real hopes, their fears, their little everyday annoyances? So often, history can feel like just a list of facts, but that feeling of the past, that's what usually gets lost. And what a world it was. We're talking 17th century London, one of the most dramatic, chaotic, and just transformative periods you can possibly imagine. It was a city of huge change, like a locked room from history. But what if I told you that someone left us the key? So, who was this person with the key? You might think he was a king, or a general, or some famous philosopher. But nope, he was an ambitious civil servant. A pretty ordinary guy, really, living in some absolutely extraordinary times, who just so happened to write everything down. His name was Samuel Pepys. So let's get to know this guy. Pepys was born into a pretty modest family, but he was incredibly smart and driven. He clawed his way up through the government to become a huge figure in the English Navy, the Secretary of the Admiralty. I mean, this was a serious job, you know? He was involved in managing wars and shaping national policy. But here's the secret sauce. For 9 incredibly eventful years, Pepys kept a private diary. And to make sure it stayed private, he wrote the whole thing in this kind of secret code, a shorthand that nobody even figured out how to read for over 100 years after he died. And that secrecy, well, that's what allowed him to be brutally and sometimes shockingly honest. And because of that honesty, his diary gives us a front row seat to history that is totally unique. He wasn't just writing about events from far away, he was living them. He was breathing the same air, walking the same streets, and feeling the same gnawing uncertainty as everyone else in London. And wow, what a decade to be keeping a diary. He kicks things off right as the monarchy is brought back with King Charles II. Then he lives through the absolute horror of the Great Plague. And just 1 year after that, he literally stands there and watches London burn to the ground in the Great Fire. For him, these aren't just bullet points in a history book. This is his daily life. And that's the whole thing right there, the candidness and detail. Pepys doesn't just say, oh, there was a plague today. No way. He describes seeing the red crosses painted on doors, the terrifying silence of the streets, and his own very real, very personal fear of getting sick. He makes history feel human. He makes it feel immediate. But the diary is so much more than just a record of big historical events. The real magic, the thing that makes you keep reading, is the man himself. Pepys gives us this incredibly intimate portrait of a complex, flawed, and honestly, a deeply relatable human being. This is what makes it a total masterpiece. Because it was written in code, it's completely unfiltered. He writes about everything: arguments with his wife, his jealousies at work, his deep love of music and going to the theater, and most famously, his own mistakes and moral failings. Nothing is off limits. And this contrast is just fascinating, isn't it? On one hand, you have the public Samuel Pepys, this high-ranking official managing the Navy during major wars. But then you open the diary and you get the private Pepys, a guy stressing about money, getting way too excited about a good play, and writing down all the ups and downs of his marriage. It's the whole person, warts and all. In the end, it's this combination that makes the diary so priceless. Historians don't just get the facts, they get the feeling, the human emotion, the everyday reality behind all those huge events. His total honesty about his own flaws is what makes him feel so real, so modern to us today. So why on earth are we still talking about a 350-year-old diary? Well, it's because its legacy is kind of twofold and it's just incredibly powerful. First, for historians, it's an absolute treasure chest. There is simply no other document from that time that's anything like it. But second, it's a genuine literary masterpiece. Seriously, it's a great read. Pepys was just a natural storyteller with a super sharp eye for detail and a witty, engaging voice that just pulls you right in. And this is really why Pepys's diary lasts. It reminds us that even when you're in the middle of history-defining plagues and fires and revolutions, life just keeps going. People still worry about their jobs, they fall in love, they get jealous, they find joy in music. It perfectly captures the messy, complicated, and beautiful truth of what it means to be human. And that kind of leaves us with a fascinating thought for our own time, doesn't it? All the things we write down, the private messages we send, the social media posts we think are gone in an instant. What story would all of that tell a historian in, say, the year 2300? What secret, unfiltered truth about our world are we recording every single day without even realizing it? Something to think. Okay, let's wind the clock back. Way back. We're talking 400 years ago to 17th century England to meet someone who was, in so many ways, a man from the future. A guy who saw our modern world long before it ever existed. But that kind of raises a big question, right? How can we possibly get a real first-hand look into a world from that long ago? How do you get past the history books and actually feel what it was like? The sights, the sounds, the worries of a completely different era? Well, the answer is you find someone who was there and who had the incredible foresight to write it all down. So let's meet John Evelyn. He was an English writer, a passionate gardener, and most importantly for us, a diarist who left behind an absolutely amazing record of his life and times. Now, Evelyn wasn't just some bystander. He was deeply woven into the very fabric of his society. Born into a wealthy family, educated at Oxford, he became a really influential member of the Royal Society. You know, that pioneering group dedicated to scientific discovery. He was a writer, a gardener, a public servant, basically a true Renaissance man living through a century of massive change. And it's actually through his diary, one of his most personal projects, that we get this incredibly vivid picture of such a turbulent time. Yeah, this was no simple Dear Diary. It's one of the most important historical documents from that entire period. It's like a time machine, giving us a direct window into the politics, the social scene, and all the cultural shifts happening in 17th century England. And wow, what a time to be alive and writing. He started his diary in 1640 and didn't stop until he died in 1706. And in between, he documented everything. The monarchy being restored, the absolutely terrifying Great Plague sweeping through London, and then, just 1 year later, the Great Fire that completely devastated the city. He saw it all, and he wrote it all down for us. But here's where Evelyn's story gets even more fascinating. His legacy goes way beyond his diary. His thinking was so modern, especially when it came to the environment. He was basically preaching what you might call a gospel of trees. So back in 1664, he published this absolutely groundbreaking book called Silva. And this wasn't just a book about how pretty trees are. Nope. It was a powerful argument for their central role in society, pushing for everything from sustainable forestry to growing timber on a massive scale for the nation. The main idea of his argument was pretty simple. Trees are absolutely vital for both practical reasons and for their beauty. He was a huge advocate for reforestation, and he actually warned people about the long-term dangers of just chopping down all the forests. This all came from his core belief that nature and society are deeply, deeply connected. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. This is an era where most people saw nature as just a resource to be used up endlessly. And here's John Evelyn writing about sustainability and the consequences of deforestation. It makes him a true pioneer of modern environmental thinking. And believe it or not, his curiosity didn't stop with diaries and trees. This was a man with an incredible range of passions. He was a perfect example of the intellectual spirit of his time. His passions were all over the map. He wrote a book called Assateria, which was all about salads and eating fresh produce. As a key guy in the Royal Society, he was a huge champion for scientific experiments. He even wrote a whole detailed guide on garden design, all about creating beautiful, harmonious landscapes. So, why are we talking about a 17th century gardener and diarist today? Well, it's because his legacy of insight and inspiration is honestly more relevant now than ever before. You see, John Evelyn wasn't just one thing. You can't put him in a simple box. He was this complex, multifaceted person who just fully embraced the world around him, championing both the beauty of nature and the pursuit of science. For him, those two things weren't at odds. They went hand in hand. And that right there is why his work is still so important. His diaries are absolutely essential for historians. His passion for plants and gardens still inspires gardeners. And his visionary ideas about the environment, they're still being studied by conservationists all over the world. Which really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. In our age, with all our urgent environmental challenges, what can we learn from the ideas of a man who, 4 centuries ago, was already asking all the right questions about our relationship with this planet? What can his vision teach us about building a truly sustainable future? All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever thought about what happens when humor becomes a weapon? Like a real weapon? That's exactly what we're diving into today. The razor-sharp world of Samuel Butler. This guy was an absolute giant in English literature, and he was a master at using wit to critique, well, pretty much everything. So yeah, that's really the core question, isn't it? For a guy like Butler, satire, it wasn't just about getting a quick laugh. No way. For him, it was like a surgeon's scalpel, a tool he used with incredible precision to cut through all the hypocrisy, the fanaticism, and just the general silliness of the society he lived in. So let's get into it. Okay, so who exactly was this master of mockery? Let's pull back the curtain a bit and see what made the man behind the pen tick. So meet Samuel Butler. Now, what's really interesting is that he was mostly self-taught, a self-directed learner who just had this incredible sharp eye for everything happening around him. And he wasn't content to just sit back and watch. Oh no, he was a critic through and through. He used his writing to just take apart the world he saw. Things like the super strict religious attitudes of his time, the craziness of political fanatics, and, all the wild and sometimes ridiculous ways people behave. And his weapon of choice? Satire. You've got to think of it as a kind of intellectual warfare, but fought with wit and humor instead of swords. He'd use irony, he'd use exaggeration, all to shine a massive spotlight on the flaws and problems in his society. And the result? It was not only super entertaining, but it was also just devastatingly on point. And believe me, Butler was not afraid to take on the big guys. He didn't just nibble around the edges. Nope, he pointed his satirical cannon right at the heart of the biggest, most explosive issue of his time, the English Civil War. And who was right in his crosshairs? The Puritans. Specifically, their intense moral and political passion. You see, Butler looked at all that zeal and saw he saw a ton of hypocrisy and absurdity that was just begging to be poked fun at. And oh boy, did he ever, in his most famous work. Okay, let's talk about Hudibras. This thing was a masterpiece. It wasn't just some poem, it was a mock heroic poem. So what does that mean? Well, imagine taking the super serious, grand style of an epic story, like the Odyssey. But instead of a great hero, your main character is a total buffoon. And that's exactly what we get. Our hero is this self-important, bumbling knight named Hudibras, and he's got his squire Ralpho, who's just as clueless. The two of them just stumble from one disaster to the next, and Butler describes it all in these hilarious, witty, rhyming couplets. It's through their ridiculous adventures that he absolutely skewers the fanaticism and folly he saw in the Puritan movement. And wow, did it make an impact? Hudibras really became a landmark in English satire. It was basically a masterclass in how to mix poetry and comedy to create this incredibly powerful and, frankly, hilarious critique of contemporary society. But Butler's sharp, satirical eye wasn't only pointed at big political events. He also turned that gaze inward, you know? He started examining the very fabric of society itself, right down to the family. And he did that in his novels. And looking at his two major novels side by side really shows you his incredible range. On one hand, you have The Way of All Flesh. This one is deeply personal, almost autobiographical. It's a sharp critique of a really strict religious upbringing and suffocating family expectations. We follow the main character, Ernest Pontifex, on his tough journey to break free and find himself. Then, on the other hand, you have Erewhon. Here, Butler zooms way out. He creates a whole new world, a whole fictional society, just so he can satirize Victorian values, especially their obsession with industrialization and progress. And Erewhon is it's such a brilliant concept. And hey, if you look closely at the name Erewhon, it's pretty much nowhere spelled backwards, which is a neat little clue. This book was way ahead of its time, almost like an early form of science fiction. In this strange land, the whole world is flipped on its head. Machines are outlawed because people are afraid they'll get too smart and take over. Being sick is considered a crime, but committing a moral crime gets you sympathy and So, he tackled politics, he tackled society, but he didn't stop there. Butler also dove into the really deep end of the pool, taking on philosophy and religion. He was really wrestling with how to make faith and reason work together. He lays out this really fascinating argument in his work, The Analogy of Religion. Basically, he said, hey, you don't have to pick a side between faith and reason. He argued that you could actually understand religious principles just by looking at the natural world. Think about it this way. Just like we can observe laws of physics in nature, he believed we could also observe a kind of moral law in how human societies function. It's a pretty cool idea. And you have to remember the context here. This was right in the middle of the Enlightenment, when everything was about evidence and reason. But what makes Butler so interesting is that instead of using reason to tear down faith, which a lot of people were doing, he used it to build a bridge between the two. He was offering a much more complex, nuanced idea that faith and reason aren't enemies. They can actually work together. All right, so when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting legacy of a writer who was so skilled with humor, with fiction, and with philosophy? Well, honestly, his legacy is huge. You could say he literally wrote the blueprint for modern satire, showing generations of writers how to mix that sharp social commentary with genuine humor. He wasn't afraid to tackle the big, messy questions, like what it means to be an individual fighting against the pressures of society. And he did it all with a kind of psychological depth that was really, really ahead of his time. And that, right there, is why we're still talking about him. His writing isn't some dusty old book on a shelf. It's a timeless look at what it means to be human. I mean, the questions he was asking about morality, about freedom, about society, they're just as relevant today as they were hundreds of years ago, maybe even more so. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Just take a look at our world today. Our politics, our social media, our technology, everything. If Samuel Butler were alive right now, with his pen and his razor-sharp wit, who or what do you think he'd be aiming at? It's a pretty fascinating thing to think about.
Hey everyone, so today we're diving into what should be a pretty simple figure in English literature, the 17th century writer Samuel Butler. But as we started digging into the source material for this explainer, we found a story that is, well, it's anything but simple. In fact, it's a genuine literary mystery.
Okay, so before we get into Butler himself, we have to talk about his weapon of choice, satire. Now, satire isn't just about making jokes. It's about using humor and irony like a scalpel to cut open and expose all the hypocrisy and silliness in society. And for a writer in 17th century England, a time of just massive political and religious chaos, it was the absolute perfect tool for the job.
All right,
First things first, let's lock in our subject in time. Samuel Butler, born 1612, died 1680. You got that? His entire life happened within the 17th century. Now, these dates are absolutely crucial, so please burn them into your brain. Everything we're about to talk about hinges on this very specific lifespan.
So, who was this guy? Well, this slide gives us a great snapshot. He wasn't some aristocrat born with a silver spoon. Nope, he was a farmer's son who basically educated himself. You just know that means he had this powerful, relentless curiosity. He became this super keen observer of the world falling apart around him and poured all of that insight into his masterpiece, a satirical poem called Hudibras. And listen, Hudibras wasn't just some poem. The source material calls it a landmark in English satire. This was Butler's signature work, the thing that would come to define not only him, but his entire era. So what exactly made it such a big deal? Well, it's a mock heroic poem. That means he used this grand, epic style, like the ancient Greek poets, to describe this totally ridiculous, pompous knight named Hudibras. It was published in a few parts between 1663 and 1678, and it took direct aim at the Puritan movement, which had just been running England during the Civil War. It was timely, it was savage, and it was incredibly clever. And this quote just nails it, right? It was a sharp, funny takedown of the politics and culture of his day. So far, this all adds up. We've got a 17th century writer writing about 17th century problems. Makes perfect sense. But this is where our nice, neat story starts to completely fall apart. Because according to our source, Samuel Butler also wrote some other pretty major works. And this is where things get really strange. Just to recap, so we are all on the same page, born 1612, died 1680. His life is locked firmly, completely inside the 17th century. Remember that. Okay, now our source also credits Butler with writing a novel called The Way of All Flesh. It's described as a semi-autobiographical critique of religious hypocrisy. Sounds like something he'd write, right? But the real question is, when was it published? 1903. Yeah, that's 223 years after he died. How is a semi-autobiographical novel published over 2 centuries after the author is gone? Something is very wrong here. But hold on, it gets weirder. Next up, another work apparently written by Butler, the philosophical novel Erewhon. This book is a critique of Victorian society and its obsession with industrialization. Victorian society, which, happened about 200 years after Butler died. And the publication date? 1872. Again, almost 2 centuries after our author passed away. The plot thickens, or maybe the timeline just dissolves. And for our last piece of completely impossible evidence, the source also gives Butler credit for a major theological work, The Analogy of Religion, which gets into all these ideas about faith and reason during the Enlightenment. This one came out in 1736. I mean, that's only 56 years after his death, but still, it's a chronological impossibility. So what on earth is going on? We have one man with one lifespan who is somehow publishing groundbreaking work across 3 different centuries. This isn't a biography anymore. This is what we're calling the Butler paradox. I mean, this is the central question, isn't it? It just breaks logic. How could a 17th century guy making fun of Puritans also be a 19th century guy worried about robots taking over? Let's just look at how different these worlds are. So on one hand, you've got Hudibras, a poem that's all about the religious fights of the English Civil War. And on the other hand, you have Erewhon, a novel basically about anxieties over the rise of machines after the Industrial Revolution. These aren't just from different decades, they are from entirely different universes. Let's just put it all on the table nice and clear. This shows you the scale of the absurdity. The Analogy of Religion, published 56 years after his gone. Erewhon, 192 years later, and The Way of All Flesh, an unbelievable 223 years after he died. The timeline we're being given by the source just doesn't work. It's impossible. So, where does that leave us? With this incredibly complicated legacy. The source material presents Samuel Butler not as a man who lived and died, but as this figure of deep, profound contradictions. A writer who somehow transcends time itself. And honestly, this might be the wildest part. The source text just sums it all up by lumping all these works together. It says Butler's contributions cover everything from 17th century satire to philosophical novels. It presents this impossible collection of work as belonging to just one guy. So the legacy we end up with is this big collection of themes, critiquing society, exploring what it means to be an individual, the craziness of human behavior. But these themes are being pulled from books written over a 200-year span, each responding to a totally different moment in history.
And that's where we're going to end it. See, this explainer wasn't really about solving the mystery. It was about laying out the puzzle exactly as it appears in our source. And it leaves us with this final, really fascinating question. What does it mean when a person's life story, their entire legacy, becomes a paradox? And what does that tell us about how history itself is sometimes written and remembered?
Some writers are just a product of their time. And then every once in a while, you get these rare figures who don't just write in an era, they basically write the era itself. John Dryden was one of those guys, a true literary giant who became the defining voice of Restoration England. But how does that even happen? How does a single writer manage to grab the political chaos, the cultural vibe, and the actual soul of a nation and put it down on paper? Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack the incredible story of John Dryden. So to really get Dryden, you have to get the world he lived in. We're talking 17th century England. And this was not a quiet, peaceful time. Oh no. It was an age of full-blown revolution, of restoring a king, of complete reinvention. And Dryden? He was right there in the middle of all of it. The thing about him is, he was a triple threat. He wasn't just a poet, or a playwright, or a critic. He was a master of all three. He completely dominated the literary scene, mixing his amazing creative work with this super sharp analysis that basically told a whole generation what was good. And just look at the world swirling around him while he worked. His career took off right after a brutal civil war. He saw the monarchy make a huge comeback. He even witnessed London burn to the ground in the Great Fire and then rise from the ashes. This wasn't just background noise for him. This was the fuel for his fire. And eventually, he got the ultimate seal of approval. In 1668, he was named the very first official poet laureate. Now, this wasn't just some fancy title. It was a statement. It cemented his place as the nation's #1 literary voice, the guy whose job it was to tell England's story back to itself. All right, let's start with his first big role, the poet. But Dryden wasn't writing poems about, pretty flowers or quiet landscapes. He was a poet of power, and he used his words like a weapon, wielding satire as a razor-sharp tool for political commentary. And his most powerful, most dangerous weapon? It was a poem called Absalom and Achitophel. Now, on the surface, it looks like he's just retelling a story from the Bible. But really, it was a genius, not so subtle takedown of a huge political crisis happening at the time over who was going to be the next king. He pulled this off using something called political allegory. And you have to understand just how risky this was. I mean, England had literally beheaded its king just a few decades earlier. To openly criticize the royal family was basically treason. So by hiding his critique inside a Bible story, Dryden found a way to jump right into the dangerous political arena without, getting his head chopped off. So check this out. This is the key to the whole thing. The biblical King David, that's actually King Charles II. His rebellious son, Absalom, that's the Duke of Monmouth. And that sneaky, treacherous advisor, Achitophel, that's a stand-in for the Earl of Shaftesbury. All of a sudden, this old story becomes this gripping piece of investigative journalism, all in verse. It's brilliant. Okay, so he's a master of the political poem. But Dryden wasn't done, not by a long shot. He was also a total titan of the London stage. He took these huge, epic stories from history and remade them with this new, raw, emotional power. And his masterpiece for the stage was All for Love. He took the most famous love story ever, Antony and Cleopatra, and he decided to tell it again, but on his own terms. He wanted to focus on the obsessive, all-consuming, destructive power of their passion. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, didn't Shakespeare already do that? And yeah, he did. But Dryden deliberately took a different approach. He stripped away all the magic, all the extra characters, and all the globetrotting to create something much more intense, a tight, almost claustrophobic psychological drama about what was going on inside their heads. And he did it all with the sheer force of his language. The dialogue is so poetic and raw, it just cuts right to the heart of their relationship. You don't just watch these two people fall apart. With Dryden's words, you actually feel the crushing weight of every single impossible choice they have to make. So we've got the poet and we've got the playwright, but this next one, this might just be his biggest impact of all. See, Dryden didn't just write great stuff. He created the rule book for how we should judge what's great. He basically became the father of English literary criticism. His big work here was called An Essay of Dramatic Poesy. And don't picture some dusty, boring textbook. He wrote it as this lively conversation between four friends, all debating what makes a play good. And by doing that, he laid out the standards for drama that would last for generations. So what does this all mean? Well, he was laying out a blueprint. He argued that plays need a moral point, they need to be focused, following what are called classical unities, which means the story happens in one place, in one day, with one main plot. And you can totally see him using his own rules in All for Love, where he takes Shakespeare's sprawling epic and boils it down to just the final desperate hours of the lovers. Okay, so poet, playwright, critic. That's a heck of a resume. But let's be real, the guy lived over 300 years ago. Why should we still care about him today? What's his lasting legacy? Well, it all comes down to these three massive pillars. As a poet, he perfected the art of political satire. As a playwright, he gave tragedy this incredible new psychological depth. And as a critic, he literally gave us the tools and the vocabulary to talk about literature. The man didn't just succeed in one field, he completely redefined three of them. And that's really the key, isn't it? Because if you peel back all the layers, the 17th century politics, the fancy language, you find he's writing about things that are completely timeless. The battle between love and duty, how power corrupts people, the clash between what we want and what's right. These are struggles that are just as real for us today. And all this leaves us with one last big question. Dryden used his art to comment on, to criticize, and maybe even to change the powerful people of his time. It really makes you wonder, when art goes head-to-head with power, who actually gets the last word? The ruler? All right, let's get into it. Imagine, just for a second, that you're living through one of the most chaotic times your country has ever seen. We're talking civil war, society literally tearing itself apart. How do you keep it together? How do you even begin to find a way forward? Well, today we're going to look at one man, Thomas Fuller, who navigated that exact storm with this incredible mix of humor, faith, and just profound wisdom. This one quote, "An ounce of mirth is worth a pound of sorrow," man, it just says it all. This was his whole philosophy in a nutshell. While everyone around him was getting swallowed up by bitterness and anger, Fuller saw humor as this powerful, essential tool for keeping your perspective. It wasn't about ignoring the chaos, not at all. It was a conscious strategy for survival and for sanity. You know, to really get Fuller, you have to understand the world he was in. We're talking about the English Civil War, right in the middle of the 17th century. This was an absolutely brutal period of political and religious fighting. Royalists against parliamentarians, neighbor against neighbor. Talk about extreme polarization. And right into the middle of all this turmoil steps Thomas Fuller. Yeah, he was a churchman, a historian, a writer, but the thing that really made him stand out was his moderate stance. In an age where you basically had to pick a side, Fuller was the guy trying to find common ground. He used his incredible wit and his sharp mind not as weapons, but as tools to build understanding and maybe, just maybe, reconciliation. So, you might be asking, how in the world did he even try to do that? Well, one of his most powerful methods was to look backwards, to turn to history. Fuller had this idea that by looking at a shared past, the people of his time could maybe find a common identity that was bigger than all the divisions of the present. And his most famous work, The History of the Worthies of England, was a total game changer. This wasn't some dry, boring list of famous people. No way. Fuller created something totally new. He blended biography with these funny personal anecdotes and moral lessons. By celebrating what Englishmen from all walks of life had achieved, he was subtly reminding a broken nation of everything they actually shared. And he took that same balanced approach to the single most explosive topic of his day, religion. I mean, think about it. At a time when religious disagreements were literally the fuel for a war, Fuller sits down and writes a history of the church that's famous for being impartial. That was a truly radical act of moderation, trying to explain different sides instead of just condemning them. But his curiosity didn't just stop with England. he also took on this massive project, a detailed geographical guide to the Holy Land. And the title itself is so cool. A Pisgah site refers to the story of Moses seeing the promised land from a distance, from Mount Pisgah. So Fuller was giving his readers that same experience, a chance to see the world of the Bible without ever leaving their homes. And he did it by making the whole thing incredibly visual. This wasn't just a wall of text. He packed it with detailed maps and illustrations to make these faraway places feel real, feel tangible. For people back in the 17th century, this was revolutionary. It was like the high-definition documentary of its day, making these Bible stories feel so much more immediate and powerful. So Fuller wasn't just a historian. He was also a kind of moral guide. But he wasn't about standing on a pedestal and preaching at people. He taught by example, using real lives to explore the real consequences of both virtue and vice. His book, The Holy State and the Profane State, became hugely popular, and its structure was just brilliant in its simplicity. On one side, he'd give you lives to look up to, saints, good parents, wise leaders. And then on the other side, he'd give you the cautionary tales, tyrants, rebels, you name it. It was such a powerful, direct way to teach ethics using real-world examples. But here's the key. It never, ever felt like a lecture. This was Fuller's genius. He could make deep moral lessons feel engaging. His writing was just bursting with these witty little sayings and sharp, memorable descriptions of people. He made learning about virtue not just important, but actually entertaining. As the Civil War just dragged on and on, Fuller's writing started to get more personal, more reflective. He turned his incredible talent toward offering comfort and spiritual guidance for a whole nation that was just hurting. He wrote Good Thoughts in Bad Times as a direct response to the chaos. The title says it all, right? It was this collection of his own reflections, meditations, and prayers. Basically a spiritual toolkit for anyone struggling. And people loved it. But the bad times? Yeah, they were about to get a whole lot worse. And as things went from bad to worse, Fuller was right there with his readers. Just 2 years later, he published the sequel. And get this title, Good Thoughts in Worse Times. You can just feel the crisis escalating in that title alone. And this wasn't just more of the same. He went deeper, offering more urgent thoughts on how to hold on to your faith when it really feels like all hope is gone. So after looking at him as a historian, a moralist, a spiritual guide, what's the big takeaway? What is Thomas Fuller's ultimate legacy? Why are we still talking about this guy almost 400 years later? When you boil it all down, Fuller's legacy is that he's a timeless model for how to get through a deeply polarized world. He proved you could have strong beliefs without hating people who disagree. He used humor to disarm tension, and he was always looking for common ground, even writing a whole book about reconciliation. He just embodied this rare and powerful combination of wisdom, wit, and a deep sense of humanity. And that really brings us to the final question, the one for right here and right now. Looking at our own world, with all of its arguments and divisions, what can we learn from a 17th century churchman who believed an ounce of mirth was worth a pound of sorrow, and that looking at our shared past might just be the best way to build a better future? That's definitely something worth thinking about. All right, let's jump right in. I want you to picture a country that's just completely torn apart, not just over politics, but over faith itself. We're talking about 17th century England, a time of massive crisis where really the entire soul of the nation felt like it was up for grabs. And right in the middle of all that chaos, two brilliant minds came along, offering two very, very different ways forward. See, this wasn't just a simple conflict between a king and his parliament. Oh no, it went much deeper than that. This was a theological battle that found its way into every single church and pretty much every home in the country. People were suddenly forced to question everything they thought they knew about God, about the church, and about how to live a good life in a world that felt like it was just falling apart. And what a century it was. I mean, it was an absolute roller coaster. It kicks off with a brutal civil war in 1642. Then, by 1649, they've executed their king and set up a republic called the Commonwealth. And just when you think you know which way is up, boom, by 1660, the monarchy is back. Can you imagine living through that kind of constant whiplash? This chaos created a desperate need for some kind of spiritual anchor in a total sea of confusion. And that is exactly where our two main guys come in. Jeremy Taylor and Richard Baxter. Both were incredibly devout, absolutely brilliant writers who looked at this crisis and just felt like they had to do something. But their solutions, their visions for how to heal this divided nation, well, they couldn't have been more different. So, first up, we've got Jeremy Taylor. Now, this guy was a champion of the established Anglican tradition. He was a high churchman through and through. For Taylor, the path back to peace was all about holding on tight to the beauty, the structure, and the authority of the historic church. You know, its formal liturgies, its ancient prayers, and its ordained clergy. He believed order would come from reinforcing what had already stood the test of time. And then, on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have Richard Baxter. Baxter was a more moderate Puritan theologian, and honestly, he was way less concerned with preserving old structures and much more focused on finding common ground. His whole deal was practical piety. He was this tireless voice for moderation and reconciliation, always trying to build bridges between all the warring religious factions in England. So, okay, those are the big ideas. But how did that translate into actual practical advice? Let's start with the individual believer. I mean, when your entire world is falling apart, how do you keep your own faith from shattering too? Both men wrote these incredibly powerful guides to answer that exact question. But, as you can guess, their approaches were pretty distinct. And the contrast here is just fascinating. Taylor's book, The Golden Grove, gives you a daily framework. It's a collection of prayers and hymns designed to root you in the rich, time-tested tradition of the church. It's all about finding spiritual order through daily practice and structure. But Baxter, he wrote The Saints' Everlasting Rest while he himself was incredibly sick. His advice? Focus on heaven. He encourages this deep internal meditation on the joys of the afterlife to give you the strength to get through the suffering of this life. So one looks to structure for support. The other looks to the horizon for hope. And this quote, wow, it just captures the fire in Baxter's work so perfectly. He wasn't just offering gentle comfort. He was sounding an alarm. His writing is packed with this direct, passionate, and really urgent plea. He was deeply personally concerned for the salvation of every single person, and he wanted to reach them directly, to stir their hearts towards a real personal conversion. Now, this focus on the individual naturally leads to their advice for the church leaders. Because it's one thing to guide yourself, right? But how in the world do you lead an entire congregation, a deeply divided flock, through a national crisis of this scale? And again, we see this incredible split. In his book, Pluribus Domini, Taylor defends the formal, traditional authority of the clergy. He argues that they are set apart, that they're called to a higher moral standard to be exemplars for everyone else. The emphasis is on their sacred office and the authority that comes with it. Baxter's book, The Reformed Pastor, is basically a how-to guide for the working minister. It's all about a hands-on, personally engaged ministry, visiting people in their homes, preaching with passion, and living a deeply pious life yourself. For Baxter, a pastor's authority didn't just come from his title, it came from his hard work and his genuine care. So what was the long-term impact of these two powerful, competing visions? Well, both men left an absolutely incredible mark on Christianity, not just in England, but around the world. But their influence, it flowed into two very different streams. So let's just sum it all up. Jeremy Taylor, the great defender of the Anglican tradition, he gave the church these works of incredible literary and poetic beauty, really strengthening it from the inside. His influence still echoes today in the majesty of formal liturgical worship. And then you've got Richard Baxter, the Puritan reconciler. He focused on pastoral diligence and personal conversion, and his work became a cornerstone for nonconformist churches and a huge inspiration for the later evangelical revivals. So here's the key takeaway. When faced with the exact same crisis, these two brilliant thinkers offered two profoundly different solutions. One path was to double down, to reinforce and beautify the traditions that had anchored the nation for centuries. The other path was to build new bridges and call for a more personal, urgent kind of faith to try and unite a fractured people. And all of that leaves us with a question that is just as relevant today as it was back in the 17th century. When society feels like it's coming apart at the seams, what do we need more? The stability that comes from tradition, or the flexibility it takes to forge a new kind of unity? It's a debate that Taylor and Baxter started, and it's one that, we are very much still having.
Imagine your world is just tearing itself apart.
All the old rules are gone, and what's left is conflict, division, and a whole lot of fear. So, in the middle of all that chaos, how do you hold on to who you are? How do you live a life that actually means something? Well, it turns out a writer from the 17th century faced that exact same reality, and he left behind a roadmap that might just be more relevant now than ever before. We're talking about the English Civil War. And listen, this wasn't just some political squabble over who gets to be in charge. No, this was a crisis that sliced right down to the soul of the nation. It turned neighbor against neighbor, shattering communities. It was a time of just deep, unsettling spiritual and social chaos. And this brings up a massive question, one that feels just as real today as it did almost 400 years ago. When everything around you feels unstable, maybe even hostile, where do you even begin to find the strength, the structure, to live with some integrity and purpose? Our guide through all this turmoil is a man named Jeremy Taylor. Now, Taylor wasn't some academic sitting in a cozy, safe office. As the chaplain to King Charles I, he was right in the thick of it, and he was on what turned out to be the losing side. His loyalty cost him big time. We're talking hardship, even prison. He wasn't just writing about chaos, he was living and breathing it every single day. And honestly, that's what makes him so incredible. Taylor wasn't just a cleric, he was a master of the written word, a literary powerhouse. And his greatest works? They weren't dreamed up in some peaceful study. They were forged in the fire of a national crisis, a direct answer to the world that was crumbling around him. So, how did he respond to all this? Well, his first big move was intensely practical. He didn't offer up some fuzzy philosophy. No, he wrote a literal, hands-on guide for how to conduct yourself, a user's manual for navigating a broken world one day at a time. He published two masterpieces, one right after the other, Holy Living and Holy Dying. Now, you can't think of them as separate books. They're two halves of a whole. One is the guide to building a good life day by day. The other is the guide to facing the end of that life with faith and a clear head. Together, they create a complete roadmap for a person's entire spiritual journey. And this is where you really see how practical he was. Holy living isn't about vague ideas. It's a clear, actionable game plan. He was basically saying, look, the world outside is a mess, so bring some order to your inner world. Control your desires, let go of your ego, be a force for good. This wasn't just feel-good advice. It was a daily workout routine for the soul. So, after laying out the framework for how to live, Taylor turned to the one thing no one can avoid. He focused on what was, for so many people at that time, a constant, terrifying reality: death. But here's the twist. twist. Taylor didn't see this as being morbid or depressing. For him, thinking about mortality wasn't about dwelling on fear. It was about gaining focus. It was a tool, really, to strip away all the trivial, distracting junk in life and find this profound clarity about what actually matters. And you absolutely have to remember the context here. During the Civil War, death was everywhere. This wasn't some theoretical exercise for them. Holy Dying was speaking directly to an audience that was facing the fragility of life every single day. And it offered them a way to face it, not with despair, but with dignity and faith. But Taylor's vision was bigger than just personal self-help. He also had a radical idea for how to heal the fractured society that was ripping itself apart. He went straight for the source of the conflict: religious intolerance. Okay, so to really get his argument, we gotta understand a key term from the title of his book, The Liberty of Prophesying. Now, when we hear prophesying, we think of predicting the future, right? But in the 17th century, it meant interpreting scripture and preaching about it. And the whole debate over who had the right to do that and whose interpretation was the correct one was literally what people were fighting and dying over. So Taylor's argument for tolerance was revolutionary. And it's brilliant in its simplicity. It's basically 3 logical steps. First, he says, let's start with a dose of humility. Let's all just admit that we're human, our understanding is imperfect, we could be wrong. Step 2 flows right from that. If we could be wrong, then we should be really, really careful about condemning other people for their beliefs. And that leads to his powerful conclusion. Let's focus on the things that actually unite us, like kindness and common sense, instead of letting arguments over dogma tear us all apart. And I mean, you can't overstate how huge this was. This one book laid the intellectual groundwork for centuries of arguments about religious freedom. In an age of absolute certainty, where people were being persecuted for their beliefs, Taylor's call for a little humility and moderation, well, it wasn't just a good idea, it was a radical act of peacemaking. So, when you put it all together, what's the lasting legacy of this writer who was forged in war? A quick look at his career shows how these big ideas didn't just define his life, they went on to shape the world long after he was gone. Just look at the timing here. All of his most important works came out right in the middle of the crisis. The Plea for Tolerance in 47, the Guides to Living and Dying in the early 1650s. Yeah, sure, after the monarchy came back, he got his reward and was made a bishop, but his real legacy had already been sealed back in those years of turmoil. And you just can't talk about Taylor's legacy without talking about his style. It wasn't just what he said, it was the incredible way he said it. His writing is just beautiful. It's elegant, it's full of poetic images, and it carries this deep moral seriousness. He managed to combine these profound ideas with absolutely breathtaking language, which is why he's still seen as a true master. And that brings us right back to where we started. Taylor wrote for a nation at war with itself, and he offered tools for both personal integrity and for social peace, which leaves us all with one final thought. In our own turbulent and, let's be honest, often divided times, what can we learn from his call for humility, for reason, and for charity? We all know the story, right? The lone hero, the solitary traveler on an impossible quest. But have you ever stopped to wonder, what happens after the credits roll? What about the family that hero left behind? Well, today we're diving into one of literature's most overlooked sequels to find out.
And it's a question we almost never get our answer to. The hero makes it to the celestial city, the day is saved, and we just assume it's happily ever after for everyone. But John Bunyan, the author of The Pilgrim's Progress, he decided that just wasn't the full picture. So he went all the way back to the city of destruction to answer that exact question. So Bunyan's answer? It comes in the form of a brand new protagonist, Christiana, who was the wife of Christian, our original hero. And The Pilgrim's Progress Part 2 isn't just a retelling, it's a whole new pilgrimage, looking at faith and salvation from a completely different angle. What's so fascinating, right from the get-go, is how different this is from the first story. Christian's journey was lonely, a solitary struggle. But Christiana's, it begins with family and community. She, her 4 sons, and her friend Mercy decide to follow in Christian's footsteps. Right from the start, this is a shared quest. As you'd probably expect, the road to the celestial city is never a walk in the park. Christiana and her group find themselves in familiar places, but their trials are unique, testing them in ways they never could have seen coming. And their first major test is a classic, the Slough of Despond. Now, anyone who's read the first book knows this place.
It's that infamous swamp of doubt and discouragement that can just swallow a pilgrim whole before their journey even really gets started.
Of course, the Slough of Despond isn't a literal mud pit. It's an allegory for that crushing feeling of hopelessness that makes you want to just give up. For Bunyan, this is the first and maybe the most dangerous spiritual trap you can fall into.
But here's where things get interesting. Their experience is different from Christians. Instead of just sinking, they're confronted by this angry dog at the gate. It's a small detail, yeah, but it shows that the allegorical landscape might be the same, but the challenges are kind of custom made for the traveler. They actually need help, a moment of mercy just to move forward.
And then the journey takes a really dangerous turn. One of Christiana's sons, Matthew, does something foolish. He steals some fruit from the devil's garden. And this one mistake kicks off a whole chain reaction. It exposes the group to new physical dangers, like thugs on the road. But it also causes Matthew to get deathly ill, not from poison, but from a spiritual sickness. It's a really stark lesson. One person's slip up can put the entire community in jeopardy. And as they push forward, these inner struggles start to become, well, real. The internal battles they're fighting against doubt and despair begin to show up as actual physical threats. They have to fight literal monsters, and each one is basically a physical form of an inner demon.
So, their first big showdown is with a giant named Maul in the Valley of Humiliation. Now, this isn't just some fantasy fight scene. It's a test of their collective courage and their faith. And by working together, they bravely take him down, proving they're getting stronger along the way.
Bunyan really leans into this idea when the group comes face to face with Giant Despair, who is maybe the most famous villain from the whole series. He isn't just a monster, he is the physical manifestation of hopelessness. For these pilgrims, defeating him means conquering that feeling inside themselves. But here's the best part. Their victory isn't just for them. They don't just escape. They actually destroy Giant Despair's castle, freeing all the other pilgrims he had trapped. This just hammers home one of the central themes of this story. Your spiritual victories can literally set other people free. And that really brings us to the single biggest difference between Christian's journey and Christiana's. While he walked so much of the path by himself, her story is all about the growing community that forms around her. First up, and probably the most important, is Greatheart. He's this warrior and guide sent to protect them. You can think of him as that mentor or protector figure, the guide you absolutely need when the going gets tough. Later on, another fighter joins them, Valiant for Truth. And yeah, as his name kind of gives away, he's all about embodying the virtue of standing firm in what you believe. Each new person they meet adds another layer of strength to their group. And the fellowship just keeps on growing. They meet Honest, an old pilgrim, Gaius, a man who gives them shelter, and even characters named Feeble Mind and Ready to Halt, who represent the weak and struggling people who are welcomed and supported by the community. This isn't a journey for spiritual superheroes, right? It's for absolutely everyone. So when you put it all together, what Christiana's journey gives us is this much broader, more inclusive vision of faith. It's not about one man's lonely struggle, but about how a whole community, a family, can lift each other up on the path to salvation. Now, it's super easy to think of John Bunyan as a one-hit wonder, but The Pilgrim's Progress was just the tip of the iceberg. His other books explore this huge range of theological ideas, creating a really rich and complex literary world. Take The Holy War, for instance. It expands that idea of an internal battle into an entire city representing the human soul. Or The Barren Fig Tree, which warns against having a faith that doesn't produce good actions. He was a writer with incredible depth, and all of these different themes just add more layers to the journey we're seeing with Christiana. So let's bring it all back to Christiana and her family. After all those trials, those battles, and all the moments of friendship, they're finally getting close to the end of their quest. And you know, unlike so many heroic stories that end in tragedy, Christiana's journey ends with peace. She completes her pilgrimage, and she's welcomed into the celestial city. Her success, along with her entire diverse group, is really Bunyan's final point. The path of faith and grace is open to everybody, no matter who you are. So in the end, Christiana's story is way more than just some forgotten sequel. It's a powerful reminder that no one makes it through their biggest challenges alone. And that leaves us with one last thought for you. When you look at your own life, your own journeys and struggles, who are the people who act as your guides and your protectors? Who are your great hearts?
All right, today we're doing a little time traveling. We're going back to the 17th century to get inside the mind of this incredible figure, a guy who managed to bridge the worlds of science and faith. We're talking about a surgeon who had the soul of a poet. His name? Sir Thomas Browne. So let me ask you this. How can a person believe in scientific proof and at the same time believe in religious miracles? It's a huge question, right? Are science and faith total opposites? Or are they just two different ways of looking at the same big mystery? Well, this wasn't just a hypothetical for a certain doctor back in the 17th century. He was living this question, trying to figure it all out in a world that was changing fast. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to look at the world he lived in, see how he tried to bring science and his faith together, and check out his battle against what he called vulgar errors, which is basically the fake news of his day. Then we'll dive into his deep thoughts on death and design, and wrap it all up with why any of this still matters to us now. So first up, a mind for a new age. To really get Thomas Browne, you've got to picture his world, the 1600s. Man, what a time. It was this crazy period of upheaval where old superstitions were crashing head-on with the very beginnings of modern science. You know, it was an era that was practically begging for a new kind of thinker, someone who could stand with a foot in both of these worlds. And that's where this idea of a polymath comes in. A polymath is someone whose knowledge is just massive. It spans all these different subjects. But it's not just about knowing a lot of trivia. A true polymath connects the dots between ideas that seem totally unrelated, and they create something brand new. And that was Browne for sure. For him, science, religion, philosophy, it wasn't in separate boxes. It was all part of one big, amazing investigation. So, was he a physician, a philosopher, a scientist, or writer? The answer is yes. He was all of those things. His day job as a doctor actually fueled his philosophical questions, and his deep faith is what pushed him to be so scientifically curious. For him, everything was connected. All right, that brings us to the religion of a doctor. This is all about how he tried to reconcile his work in science with his Christian faith. His first huge work was called Religio Medici, which literally means the religion of a doctor. And it was basically his personal manifesto, him working through how a guy who deals in facts and evidence could also be a person of deep faith. So in this book, which came out in 1643, he lays it all out. He makes this argument that science isn't some threat to his faith. Actually, it's the opposite. He saw it as a way to better understand and appreciate God's incredible creation. He was really pushing for a kind of faith that wasn't rigid or dogmatic, but was full of intellectual curiosity and tolerance, totally open to the mysteries of the universe. Okay, so now we're moving on to debunking vulgar errors. You see, Browne's curiosity wasn't just about the big spiritual questions. He was also a passionate debunker. You could almost call him a 17th century fact checker. His masterpiece on this subject, Pseudodoxia Epidemica, was all about taking on what he called vulgar errors, which is just a fantastic old-timey way of saying misinformation. This is what's so wild. He critiqued what he called the uncritical acceptance of tradition. He was arguing for empirical investigation and reason. I mean, think about that. We're talking almost 400 years ago, and this guy is already talking about the dangers of just accepting what you're told without any evidence. He was telling people, hey, observe for yourself, investigate, use your own reason. And the stuff he went after was, well, it was all over the place. He looked into common superstitions, myths, folklore, all sorts of falsehoods in natural history, and even popular medical beliefs. I'm talking about things like, do elephants really not have knees? Or do griffins actually exist? He went through these popular myths one by one and just systematically took them apart, replacing all that folklore with actual facts. But Browne wasn't just a fact checker. His mind was equally comfortable in the world of poetry and deep philosophy. So for our next section, Meditations on Death and Design, we're shifting gears a bit. His later works really dig into these two huge opposing forces of existence. You've got the inevitable decay of death on one hand and the beautiful, complex order of life on the other. Okay, so imagine this. Some construction workers unearth these ancient Roman burial urns. This discovery sparks one of his most famous works, Hydrida Thafia, Urn Burial. It's this incredibly solemn, poetic meditation on mortality, on how everything is temporary and how everything eventually decays. It's pretty heavy stuff, exploring the idea that trying to be remembered forever is kind of pointless. In the end, as he saw it, we're all forgotten.
Everything just turns to dust. But then, published at the same time, you have The Garden of Cyrus. And it is the complete opposite. It's a celebration of order, of design, of life. In this work, he's actively searching for hidden patterns in the natural world, looking for proof of a divine harmony. He gets really obsessed with this one geometric pattern called the quincunx. It's basically 5 points arranged like the 5 on a die. And he starts seeing it everywhere, in everything from plants to snowflakes. So you see this incredible contrast, right? With Urn Burial, the theme is death and decay, the tone is solemn, and it's all about human impermanence, looking at archaeology and history. But with The Garden of Cyrus, the theme is life and order, the tone is celebratory and complex, and the focus is on divine design, pulling from botany and even mysticism. These two works are like the two hemispheres of Brown's brain, one side staring into the abyss of death, and the other finding this beautiful divine blueprint in nature. Okay, so why are we talking about a doctor from the 1600s? Why does Brown still matter? I think it's because the struggle he was going through, trying to balance faith with reason, skepticism with wonder, that's a struggle that feels incredibly modern. It's our struggle too. His relevance really endures for a few key reasons. First, he showed that you don't have to choose between faith and reason, that they can actually make each other richer. Second, he was a huge champion for scientific curiosity, pioneering this skeptical, evidence-based way of looking at the world. Third, the guy could write. His prose was just beautiful, poetic, and philosophical. And finally, he was asking the big universal questions, the ones about life, death, and what it all means. Those never go out of style. So I want to leave you with this question. If Sir Thomas Browne were suddenly dropped into our world today, what widely held beliefs of ours would he label a vulgar error? What modern ideas, superstitions, or bits of common knowledge would he tell us to go out and investigate for ourselves? Makes you think, doesn't it? You ever feel like the human mind is just the most complicated, fascinating, and let's be honest, baffling thing in the universe? We've got all this modern science, but we're still figuring ourselves out. Well, what if I told you one of the best guides to our inner world isn't new at all? What if one of the most thorough, insightful, and, believe it or not, hilarious guides to what we now call depression was written 400 years ago? Yeah, that's exactly what we're digging into today, a masterpiece from 1621 that feels like it could have been written yesterday. So, here's our game plan. First up, we're going to meet the guy who wrote this incredible book. Then, we'll slice into the masterpiece itself. After that, we'll explore its universe of ideas, meet his fascinating alter ego, and finally, we'll get into why this ancient text still hits so close to home. So, who was the brilliant mind behind all of this? Let's meet the man who literally wrote the book on sadness. The man's name was Robert Burton. And when I say he was a polymath, I mean this guy was a one-man intellectual universe. We're talking about a scholar, a writer, a clergyman who was obsessed with everything from medicine and philosophy to psychology and literature. He was basically the human equivalent of the internet in the 17th century. But here's the real kicker. This wasn't just some dusty academic project for him. Burton himself struggled deeply with melancholy. Writing this enormous book was his own way of dealing with it, his personal therapy. He was dissecting the subject to try and understand his own mind. Okay, so we've met the man. Now for his masterpiece. And honestly, just calling it a book doesn't do it justice. It's more like a sprawling 17th century encyclopedia of the human mind. This thing first hit the shelves way back in 1621. It was Burton's life's work, an absolutely exhaustive dive into what we'd now call depression, but seen through the eyes of a world that was a mix of Renaissance thinking and medieval tradition. Now, you might think a book this massive would be a total mess, right? Nope. Burton was super methodical. He breaks the whole thing down into 3 clear parts. First, what causes melancholy. Second, what it looks and feels like. And third, how you can try to cure it. It's a surprisingly logical roadmap through a very complex topic. But look, if you're picturing some dry, old medical text, think again. This book is an absolute universe of ideas. It's about way more than just medicine. I mean, the sheer range here is staggering. Burton doesn't just talk about sadness, he gets specific. He dives into religious melancholy, love melancholy, which is a big one, even the melancholy that scholars feel. He ties it all into these huge human experiences like grief, ambition, and despair. And to back all this up, he pulled from, well, everything. Seriously, he's quoting classical philosophers, medieval texts, Renaissance thinkers, literature, mythology, science. He even throws in astrology. This was a grand synthesis of pretty much all of Western knowledge up to that point. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. This sounds incredibly heavy, but here's the secret sauce. The book is actually funny. It is packed with scholarly knowledge, for sure, but it's also overflowing with wit, irony, and really personal, relatable insights. The guy was a master of blending high-minded ideas with a kind of dry, self-aware humor. And a lot of that unique voice comes from a kind of character Burton created for himself, which just adds another whole fascinating layer to this work. So, he wrote under the name Democritus Jr. Now, why that name? Well, the original Democritus was an ancient Greek philosopher who was known as the laughing philosopher because he thought the follies of mankind were just absurd and kind of funny. So Burton takes on this persona of a wise, satirical observer looking down on it all. And this duality is really the key to the whole book. You've got two things happening at once. On one side, there's Robert Burton, the man, looking inward, trying to figure out his own sadness. On the other side, you have Democritus Jr., the persona, looking outward and critiquing all the things in society, the greed, the ambition, the silliness that make us all miserable. It's brilliant. So let's be real for a second. A huge, dense, 400-year-old book written by a melancholy scholar. Why on earth should we care about it today? What makes it so timeless? Well, for one, its influence is just undeniable. For centuries, it's been a secret weapon for other great writers. In the 18th century, a guy like Samuel Johnson loved it. In the 19th, romantic poets like John Keats were totally inspired by it. And today, it fits right into our modern conversations about mental health in a way that is just uncanny. But at the end of the day, the reason this book lasts is because it's so profoundly human. Burton's deep, compassionate, and sharp-witted take on sorrow, on anxiety, on just how messy our emotions are, it feels completely modern. He's reminding us that none of this is new. We've been feeling this way for a very, very long time. And that kind of leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? As we're all trying to navigate our own complicated lives, you have to wonder, how many of our so-called modern anxieties are really just echoes bouncing across 4 centuries from the pages of a book that saw it all coming? Hey, welcome. Today we are diving into the world of one of the most important authors in all of English literature. Get this, he was a guy who from a prison cell managed to literally map out the journey of the human soul. A map that, well, it had 2 very different destinations. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to meet the man himself, the prisoner who became a legendary preacher. Then we'll explore his 2 masterpieces, the famous Journey Towards Salvation and its dark twin, The Path Straight to Damnation. After that, we'll see how these 2 paths stack up against each other. And finally, we'll unpack why his vision still resonates with us hundreds of years later. So you've got to wonder, right? How does a man locked up in jail go on to write one of the most famous books of all time? Well, that's exactly where the incredible story of John Bunyan begins. I mean, just listen to the scale of that title. The Pilgrim's Progress from this world to that which is to come, delivered under the similitude of a dream. It sounds so epic, so grand. You'd think it was written in some vast, quiet university library. But no, it was dreamed up behind bars. John Bunyan was a preacher in 17th century England, and it was a time of serious religious turmoil. He got thrown in jail because he violated something called the Conventicle Act, which basically means he was preaching without getting the okay from the official Church of England. Now, back then, unauthorized religious meetings were seen as a major threat to the social order, so his defiance landed him in prison. And it was right there, in that jail cell, that he poured his powerful faith into his most famous works. All right, so let's crack open the book that made his name famous for centuries. Let's take a walk down the road to the celestial city in the Pilgrim's Progress. The basic idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound. You've got a man named Christian, weighed down by his sins, who decides to flee his home, the city of destruction, and start this long, hard journey to the celestial city, which is, heaven. It's basically the ultimate spiritual road trip. And let me tell you, this journey is anything but a walk in the park. Christian has to navigate some seriously treacherous places that are all symbols for our own inner struggles. Right after leaving home, he gets stuck in the Slough of Despond, a literal swamp of despair. He has to battle a monster named Apollyon, survive the endless temptations of Vanity Fair, and then finally cross the terrifying river of death before he can even reach the gates of the celestial city.
Now, the reason all this works so well is because the entire book is a brilliant allegory. So what that means is that every single character, every single location, it isn't just a plot point. It's a symbol for something bigger, a real-world temptation, a virtue, or a spiritual challenge that we all face. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Just 2 years after publishing this hopeful masterpiece, Bunyan wrote the complete opposite story, a roadmap not to heaven, but one that leads straight to hell.
And this comparison just lays out the contrast perfectly. Where Christian's goal is salvation and his path is all about spiritual struggle, Mr. Badman's goal is just vice and corruption. His path isn't about overcoming anything. It's about diving headfirst into greed and selfishness. Their destinations couldn't be more different. Unlike the fantastical, dreamlike vibe of Pilgrim's Progress, this book is totally different. It's written as a realistic, serious conversation between two friends, Mr. Wiseman and Mr. Attentive. They're basically just discussing the life of the recently deceased Mr. Badman, and they use his story as this powerful cautionary tale about what happens when you live a life without any kind of moral compass.
And the full extent of his failure in life really hits home when he dies. Bunyan makes the point to show that Badman got none of the honors you'd expect for a respectable person. There was no memorial for him, no awards or achievements to speak of, no sermon was preached about his life, and, this is the real kicker, nobody even mourned him. His life left absolutely zero positive trace on the world.
So you've got these two completely different books, these two very different paths, all from the same author. What gives? How do they fit together to paint a complete picture? Well, it all comes down to purpose. When you put the two books side by side like this, the contrast is just crystal clear. Pilgrim's Progress uses that dreamlike allegory to inspire you, to guide you. It's hopeful. Mr. Badman, on the other hand, uses realistic dialogue to warn you. It's serious. They're basically two different tools for two different jobs. One is a map to heaven, and the other is a giant warning sign for the road to hell. Okay, so let's fast forward a few hundred years. Why are we still talking about these stories written way back in the 1600s? What gives them such incredible staying power? Well, for starters, The Pilgrim's Progress became a global phenomenon. I mean, it blew up. It was translated into countless languages and became a cornerstone of both Christian literature and, the wider literary world in general. Its simple, powerful story just connected with people everywhere. And that really gets to the heart of it. That's the crucial point. Bunyan's true genius wasn't just his deep faith. It was his incredible skill as a storyteller. He could take these huge, complicated ideas about sin and redemption and faith and despair, and he could turn them into characters and adventures that anyone, and I mean anyone, could understand. He made theology feel like an epic adventure story.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Bunyan presented two very clear paths, one of struggle that leads to a great reward, and one of selfishness that leads to ruin. In our modern world, which is so often full of moral gray areas and really complex choices, does that kind of clear black and white map of right and wrong still have something valuable to show us? Does it still point the way?
You know how most epic stories end, right? The hero gets to their goal, they win the day, and we close the book and think, well, that's the end. But what if it wasn't? What if that was just the beginning of another story? Today, we're diving into the incredible tale that one of literature's greatest authors decided to tell after everyone thought the journey was already over. So let's start with that question right there. Seriously, think about it. The hero triumphs, but what about the family they left back home? What happens to their world after the adventure is done? It's a question most stories just ignore. But John Bunyan, he decided to answer it. And this right here is what makes his work so unbelievably cool. After he wrote the legendary The Pilgrim's Progress, he actually went back to that world. Why? To tell the story of Christiana, the wife of his original hero, Christian. He gave us a part 2, a sequel that honestly changes how you see the entire journey. Okay, so let's get into it. The second part is all about Christiana Wynne. And she is not some side note to her husband's story. Oh no. She becomes the hero of her very own epic pilgrimage. And her journey, you'll see, is in so many ways deeper and even more powerful than the one we thought we knew. And this is where you see a huge shift in Bunyan's entire vision. See, part 1 was this intense, lonely struggle. It was all about one man's quest. But part 2 just blows that wide open. Suddenly, the path to salvation isn't a solo mission anymore. It's a community project. It's about family, about supporting each other, and this really radical idea that this path is for everyone, women and kids included. It's a journey you walk together. So, how does this journey actually play out? Well, Christiana doesn't go it alone. She takes her kids, and her friend Mercy comes along too. Right from the start, they get this amazing guardian to help them. And together, they don't just face down their enemies, they totally defeat them, clearing the path for anyone else who might come after. And speaking of allies, let's talk about a key player. Everybody meet Greatheart. This guy is a brand new character in part 2, and I'm telling you, he's a total game changer. He's way more than just a guide. He's like this divinely sent bodyguard. He's armed, he's ready to fight, and he basically represents the active, powerful protection that God offers to the faithful. His presence changes everything. But, of course, the road is still full of bumps. One of Christiana's sons, Matthew, he makes a mistake and gets terribly sick. It's a really strong symbol for the consequences of sin. But then help shows up, a doctor named Skill, who represents repentance. And you start to see a theme here. They don't just travel, they rescue people along the way, like Feeblemind, and they gather more friends. This whole journey is about lifting each other up. And that brings us to the big bad of the story, Giant Despair. This guy lives in Doubting Castle, and he is the perfect symbol for that crushing hopelessness that can just completely wreck your spiritual journey. In the first book, our hero Christian barely gets away from him. But in part 2, things go down very, very differently. This right here is where the sequel just shines. Christiana, Greatheart, and their crew, they don't just escape Giant Despair. No way. They march right up to Doubting Castle and they fight him. They completely defeat him, tear his fortress to the ground, and free every single prisoner inside. They don't just survive despair, they conquer it for everyone. It's an incredible shift from just personal survival to liberating the whole community. But, this whole pilgrimage thing wasn't Bunyan's only epic allegory. In his other masterpiece, The Holy War, he took this whole idea of conflict and just scaled it way, way up. He imagined the human soul itself as a literal city under siege. It's a massive spiritual war on a completely different level. So get this, in the Holy War, the human soul is a city called Mansoul. The whole story is a full-on military campaign between God, who's called Shaddai, and Satan, called Diabolus, as they fight for control of this city. The characters are literally parts of our mind, like will and conscience. It's this incredibly ambitious, complex picture of the spiritual war that rages inside every single one of us. And believe it or not, these epic allegories were just the tip of the iceberg. Bunyan was also a super passionate and productive theologian. He wrote dozens of other books and pamphlets. And when you look at them all together, you get this whole library of faith that gives us a much clearer picture of what he truly believed, way beyond just his famous stories. I mean, his range was just incredible. In one book, The Barren Fig Tree, he's arguing that real faith has to lead to good actions. Then in another, of Antichrist, he's giving this fiery warning against corrupt institutions. And then you have something like The Jerusalem Sinner Saved, which offers this beautiful promise that nobody is too far gone for God's grace. He was tackling the biggest questions out there, which really makes you wonder, where did all of this come from? Okay, so to really get John Bunyan, you have to know where he wrote his most famous books. They weren't dreamed up in some comfy study with a fireplace. Nope. They were forged in the fire of a prison cell. And that context is everything. 12 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. For more than a decade, John Bunyan was locked up. And for what? For his beliefs. This unbelievable stretch of suffering became the very soil where his incredible imagination and deepest spiritual ideas took root. So why was he arrested? It was for preaching without an official license from the state church. As a nonconformist, he just refused to be silenced. And for that, they threw him in jail. And it was right there in that cell that he came up with and wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. His own writings from that time show a guy whose faith wasn't just crushed by all this, it was strengthened by it. And you have to think, when he created the monster Giant Despair and his Doubting Castle, he wasn't just writing fiction. He was writing about the very walls around him and the hopelessness he had to fight off every single day. So, after all this, the sequel, the allegories, the theology, the sacrifice, what's Bunyan's real legacy? I mean, why are we still talking about a preacher from the 1600s today? I think this quote just nails it. It's that perfect mix, deep, heavy theological ideas, told through these unforgettable stories, all written in a way that regular people could actually understand. He made that inner, spiritual journey feel so real, so tangible. And that's why his work is still a cornerstone of literature. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Bunyan gave his world this powerful roadmap for life, and it was filled with giants of despair and valleys of humiliation. It just makes you wonder, what are the maps and metaphors we use for our own lives today? What are our giants? And who is our great heart that helps us get through it all? Okay, so when I say the name John Milton, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's got to be the towering figure of English literature, right? The blind poet who gave us the absolute masterpiece, Paradise Lost. And yeah, you wouldn't be wrong. But what if I told you that's only like half the story? What if, for 2 whole decades, arguably the most critical decades of his life, Milton the poet basically took a back seat? And in his place stepped Milton the radical, the pamphleteer, the revolutionary. You see, during the huge, chaotic turmoil of the English Civil War, Milton pretty much put all his literary dreams on hold. Instead, he picked up a totally different kind of weapon, his pen. And with it, he churned out more than 20 fiery prose works. And these weren't just essays, they were like intellectual grenades he just kept lobbing at the very foundations of his society. So, where does a rebellion like this even start? Well, for Milton, his first target was the biggest, most powerful institution around at the time, the Church of England. Get this, between 1641 and 1642, just in that short span, he unleashes this absolute barrage of attacks against the church leadership. And we're not talking about gentle suggestions for reform here. No way. These pamphlets with titles like Of Reformation were a full-on assault. His basic argument? The whole structure was rotten to its very core. And his approach was actually super logical. Step 1, he attacks the church hierarchy. He's basically saying the whole system of bishops is corrupt and totally authoritarian. Step 2, he calls for a return to something much simpler, like the early Christian church. And step 3, and this is absolutely key, he insisted that the Bible and only the Bible should be the ultimate authority. Not human traditions, not some fancy church structure. But Milton was just getting started. His fight wasn't going to stop at the church doors. From tearing down institutions, his radical ideas just exploded into this huge defense of individual liberty. And I mean liberty everywhere, from the halls of Parliament right down to the privacy of your own home. And this incredible quote here, it comes from probably his most famous piece of prose, Areopagitica. And it is this incredibly passionate defense of free speech, written to fight back against government censorship. His main point was simple but powerful. Truth is strong. It's strong enough to win any fight on its own. It doesn't need the government to protect it. He was convinced that truth really emerges when ideas clash. You have to let them duke it out. For Milton, allowing a totally free and open debate, even for ideas you might find, offensive or wrong, is the only way for a society to actually become virtuous and enlightened. It's pretty much the blueprint for what we now call the marketplace of ideas. And this fight for liberty, it went into the most personal space imaginable. Marriage. Okay, so at the time, the traditional view was that marriage was this unbreakable, lifelong contract, period. But then Milton comes along with his doctrine and discipline of divorce and argues for something that was, frankly, revolutionary. He said a real marriage is a union of minds and spirits, and if that spiritual connection fails, it should be dissolvable. I mean, this was all about championing real human dignity over some rigid, loveless tradition. Okay, so let's recap. We've gone from the church to the press to the home. There was really only one place left for his revolution to go, right? The throne itself. And this is where things get really intense. He's about to provide the intellectual justification to kill a king. And listen, these were not some abstract academic theories he was writing from an ivory tower. No, these were urgent, real-time justifications, written in the immediate white-hot chaos right after the English Civil War. In 1649, literally right after they executed King Charles I, Milton publishes The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. Its whole purpose? To defend the people's right to get rid of a tyrant. Now, at the very heart of all these political arguments was a principle that would literally change the world, the consent of the governed. Milton argued so forcefully that a government's right to rule comes from the people, not from God. Power, he insisted, flows up from the citizens, not down from some king. And that logic led him to his most explosive conclusion of all. Rulers are accountable to the people they rule. So if a king becomes a tyrant, the people don't just have a right to resist them, they have a moral duty to overthrow them. I mean, you have to understand, in the 17th century, this was absolute political dynamite. So, what's the legacy of all this? I mean, eventually the monarchy was restored in England. So, what happened to Milton's radical, kind of unfinished revolution? Well, yeah, the monarchy came back, but the ideas that Milton championed, they never went away. His prose literally laid out a blueprint for a totally new kind of society, one built on freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and the fundamental idea that people have power over kings. And these weren't just some dusty 17th century arguments. They became the foundational pillars for huge events like the American and French revolutions over 100 years later. When you boil it all down, Milton's most revolutionary act was his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths directly to power. He risked everything: his reputation, his freedom, maybe even his life, all for the sake of ideas. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? His revolution was aimed at the 17th century. So what truths are we afraid to confront today? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into one of the most ambitious and, honestly, legendary poems ever written, John Milton's Paradise Lost. It is an absolutely epic story about rebellion, temptation, and, well, how humanity lost everything. So let's just jump right in. Milton doesn't start with a hero or a big battle scene. Nope. Right from the get-go, he tells you exactly what this is all about. One single act of disobedience. He lays it all out. This one choice is what brought death and suffering into the world. It's the entire conflict of the poem, right there in the first few lines. Now, to really get this poem, you have to understand the man who wrote it and his absolutely monumental goal. See, Milton wasn't just retelling a story from the Bible. He was trying to tackle one of the biggest questions in all of theology. So, on the surface, what is Paradise Lost? It's the story of Adam and Eve, Satan's temptation, and getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But really, it is so much more than that. It's a deep psychological dive into a war in heaven, into free will, justice, and whether or not redemption is even possible. And the man behind it all, John Milton, was an absolute powerhouse. We're talking about a guy who was intensely religious, a political firebrand who wrote about free speech, and was soaked in classical literature. And he poured every ounce of that passion and intellect into this one masterpiece. Okay, now we get to the character everyone talks about. What's so wild about this poem and what has fascinated people for centuries is that the most compelling, the most charismatic character is the villain. For Milton, who had just lived through a massive civil war, the idea of a charming rebel fighting against an all-powerful king, well, that felt very, very real. I mean, listen to this. After losing the war against God and getting tossed into hell, Satan is completely defiant. He drops this incredible line, basically saying, "You can put me in hell, but you can't control my mind." He's reframing his own damnation as a kind of mental freedom. It's incredible stuff. And this really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? He'd rather be a king in the worst place imaginable than a servant in paradise. For Satan, it is absolutely 100% better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That single idea defines his entire being. So plan A, direct warfare, was a total failure. Time for plan B. He knows he can't win with brute force, so he switches to sabotage. He gets his fallen angels all fired up and then volunteers for a solo mission to go to this brand new world, Earth, and corrupt God's favorite new project, humanity. And what's the first thing you do when you're building a new kingdom in hell? You build a capital city, of course. In this amazing show of defiance, they literally mine the depths of hell and build this incredible palace, Pandemonium, which literally means all the demons. It's like a twisted, dark mirror of heaven. All right, so Satan is on his way. Our bad guy is established. Now the scene shifts to Earth, and the stage is set for the real heart of the drama, the temptation in the Garden of Eden. And what does he find there? He finds Adam and Eve. And Milton describes them as living in the state of just perfect, blissful innocence. They are in total harmony with nature, with each other, with everything. I mean, this place, the Garden of Eden, is perfect. It's lush, it's beautiful, it even has a tree of life. But you know there's always a but, right? Their whole perfect life comes with one single test, one restriction, all centered on another tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just one. That's it. Think about that. Their entire perfect world, all of it, hangs on following this one single, simple rule. Don't eat the fruit from that one tree. Seems easy enough, right? And this is where Satan makes his move. He slips into the garden, finds Eve by herself, and he doesn't just show up with horns and a pitchfork. No way. He's smart. He takes the form of a serpent, and he is masterfully persuasive. He uses flattery, logic, and straight up lies, arguing that God is just trying to keep them down, to keep them ignorant. So Eve eats the fruit, and when Adam finds out, he's just horrified. But here's the crucial part. He's not tricked by Satan. He knows exactly what he's doing. But his love for Eve is so complete. He can't imagine a life without her. So he makes a conscious choice. He would rather be damned with her than live in paradise alone. And boom, the second they both eat the fruit, everything changes. The world is never the same. Their innocence is gone, and the consequences aren't just personal. They ripple out and affect the entire world. So, Judgment Day arrived. The Son of God comes down to deliver the sentences. The serpent is cursed, of course. And Adam and Eve, well, they receive punishments that will basically define the entire human condition from that point forward. Pain, hard labor, and a whole new kind of social order. And get this, it wasn't just them. Their personal choice had cosmic consequences. The entire planet changed. Suddenly there are harsh seasons. Animals that used to live peacefully together start hunting and killing each other. Their fall literally broke the world. And that's it. Game over. They can't stay in the garden anymore. The Archangel Michael comes down to lead them out, and their journey into a much harsher, mortal world officially begins. But wait, just when you think it's all doom and gloom, Milton gives us a sliver of hope. Before they're actually kicked out for good, Adam is given a vision, a sneak peek into the future of mankind. And it is a real roller coaster. Adam sees the absolute worst of humanity: murder, war, sin, you name it. But mixed in with all that darkness, he also sees these moments of divine mercy and this growing sense that there's a long-term plan for salvation, a plan that eventually leads to the promise of a savior. And all of this leads to a really fascinating, kind of mind-bending idea called the fortunate fall. Now that sounds crazy, right? How could their fall be fortunate? Well, the argument goes like this. Their tragic mistake actually allowed God to show his greatest qualities: grace and mercy. Without the fall, they'd just be innocent. But through redemption, humanity can achieve something even greater. So after all of that, the war in heaven, the temptation, the epic vision of all of human history, the poem ends on this incredibly quiet, human, and just heartbreaking image. Adam and Eve, with nothing left but each other, walking hand in hand into an unknown world. Which brings us to the one big question people have been arguing about for literally centuries. When you look at his defiance, his passion, his incredible speeches, you have to ask yourself, is the charismatic villain actually the hero of this story? It's a question that makes you rethink what a hero even is.
Today, we're going to time travel back to the 17th century to meet a poet whose most famous piece of advice feels, more urgent now than ever before. His message was simple: seize the day.
You know that feeling, right? That little bit of panic when you realize the clock is just always ticking, and that maybe precious moments are slipping right through your fingers. It's a feeling that people have been wrestling with forever, and it brings us to a really famous idea. Carpe diem. We've all heard the phrase, but what's it really about? Well, at its heart, it's this powerful, urgent call to action. It's saying, hey, embrace right now. Find joy in the present, because our time here is limited. And there was one poet who became the absolute, undisputed master of this whole philosophy. And that master was Robert Herrick. So let's dive in and explore how this 17th century writer totally perfected the art of seizing the day, and why his words, centuries later, still hit us right where we live.
So, who exactly was Robert Herrick? Well, he was an English poet, and here's the interesting part. He was also a clergyman, a man of the church. He was a big deal among the Cavalier poets who were supporters of King Charles I during the super brutal English Civil War. And you gotta remember that context. In a world that was literally tearing itself apart, their focus on beauty, love, and nature wasn't just fluff. It was a defiant choice to celebrate the good things in life while they still could.
What is so fascinating about Herrick is this deep split in his work.
I mean, on one hand, you've got these vibrant, almost scandalous poems about earthly pleasures. And on the other hand, as a clergyman, he wrote these profound religious poems. You'd think those two worlds would clash, but for Herrick, they didn't. He found this beautiful balance, seeing God in a flower and poetry in a prayer. He celebrated it all. And that beautiful balance he struck leads us right to his most famous, his absolute signature theme, the one that he captured in a single line that you've almost certainly heard before. This line. Seriously, if you know anything by Robert Herrick, it's probably this. It's from his poem, To the Virgins, To Make Much of Time, and it has become the ultimate anthem for the whole Carpe Diem spirit. It's not just a nice phrase, it's a beautiful, urgent plea. So what's he really saying? The message couldn't be clearer. Those rosebuds, they're a metaphor for youth, for beauty, for all the amazing opportunities life throws at you. And Herrick is warning us that old time is relentless. He's saying, don't wait. Don't put joy on the back burner, because that chance might not come around again. And this idea of fleeting time, it just runs through everything he wrote. To the Virgins is his famous call to action, basically telling young people not to waste a second. Then you have To Daffodils, which is just heartbreakingly beautiful. He compares our short lives to a flower that blooms and is gone in a day. It's a reminder to appreciate beauty because it doesn't last. And Corinna's Going a-Maying is pure joy, a poem that practically grabs you by the hand and yanks you outside to celebrate just being alive. But his whole philosophy wasn't just about the ticking clock. Herrick was a true master at finding these massive, profound meanings in two of life's most powerful forces, love and the natural world. And let's be clear, Herrick was not shy about celebrating love and physical beauty. Just look at his famous poem, Upon Julia's Clothes. He doesn't just say her dress is nice, he describes the way it moves, the liquefaction of the silk. He captures not just a picture, but a feeling. That feeling of being totally captivated by someone's beauty. It's an absolute masterclass. And he was constantly using the natural world to explain these huge, complicated human emotions. In The Vine, a plant becomes this perfect symbol for how two lovers' lives twist and grow together until they're inseparable. The song of a nightingale isn't just a bird. For Herrick, it's a moment of divine inspiration. He even finds a sweet sorrow in the pain of saying goodbye, showing that even the tough parts of love have their own kind of beauty. Okay, so this was all written almost 400 years ago. Why are we still talking about it? Why does any of this still matter today? Well, let's take a look at his incredible, enduring legacy. When you look at this timeline, you realize just how long ago this was. He published his masterpiece, Hesperides, in 1648. That's right in the middle of a massive war that was tearing his country apart. And yet, that core message, find and hold on to joy in the present moment, it's never gone out of style. It has echoed down through the centuries, inspiring poets, artists, and yeah, probably a few of us too. In the end, Herrick's legacy really comes down to his incredible skill. He could take a personal feeling and make it feel universal. He could write about the shimmer of a silk dress or the short life of a flower and make you feel something profound. He showed us all how to find deep, real meaning in life's simple pleasures, and that's why he's remembered as one of the all-time greats. When you really boil it all down, Herrick's whole philosophy is refreshingly simple. What makes a good day? It's not about grand accomplishments or changing the world. For him, it's about love, it's about laughter, and it's about taking just one moment to appreciate the fleeting beauty all around you before it disappears. And that brings Herrick's 400-year-old challenge right to our doorstep, doesn't it? He urged people to make much of time. He told Corinna to get out there and celebrate. So I'll leave you with the same question, pulled straight from his work. What fleeting, beautiful thing will you make much of? You know, when you think of a great story, chances are you're thinking of a novel, right? It's just the way we tell stories now. But have you ever stopped and wondered what was there before the novel? And how on earth did this one type of story come to completely take over the world? Well, that's what we're going to dig into. Here's our game plan. First up, we're going to look at why a new kind of story was even needed in the first place. Then, we'll get into the secret recipe that cooked it up in the 18th century. After that, we'll dive into the Victorian era, when things just exploded. We'll also meet some of the heavy hitters, the voices that defined an age, and finally, we'll talk about why the novel still has such a grip on us today. So, let's rewind the clock. Before the 18th century, if you picked up a popular, respected story, well, it probably wouldn't be about anyone you'd recognize. The main characters and the people reading about them were from a completely different world. For literally centuries, literature was all about the big stuff. You had these epic poems and grand tragedies. They were all about gods, kings, and legendary heroes. You know, people you'd never just meet down at the market. But then things started to shift. Society was changing. A brand new middle class was on the rise. And they were getting more powerful, more educated, and honestly, they were hungry for stories that weren't about gods, but about them. Their daily lives, their struggles, their dreams of climbing that social ladder. And that's where the novel comes in. It was basically invented to fill that exact void. I mean, the name itself comes from the Italian word novella, which just means a little new thing. And it really truly was new. We're talking about a long story written in everyday prose, not some fancy poetry. It was all about characters you could actually believe in, caught up in complex situations that felt totally real, even if the story itself was made up. Now, something like the novel doesn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. It was more like a perfect storm. You had all these different ingredients swirling around in the 18th century, creating the absolute perfect conditions for this new art form to be born. Okay, so what were these ingredients? Well, for one, traditional plays, which had been the main way people got their stories, were kind of fading in popularity. At the same time, you had these things called periodical essays popping up. You could think of them like the hot blogs of the 1700s. They were filled with witty, smart takes on social life and regular people, so folks were getting used to reading about everyday stuff. On top of all that, there was this growing idea that, hey, the lives of common people actually matter. People wanted stories that felt real. The stage was perfectly set, and leading the charge were four trailblazing authors. We're talking about Richardson, Smollett, Fielding, and Sterne. These guys were so important, so crucial to getting this whole thing off the ground that they're now known as the four wheels of the novel. They literally carried the entire genre forward. So, if the 18th century mixed the ingredients and lit the fuse, then the 19th century, the Victorian era, was the massive explosion. This is when the novel went from being this interesting new thing to an absolute world-changing cultural force. And when I say explosion, I mean it. The numbers are just mind-boggling. Think about this. At the start of the Victorian era, maybe 100 new novels came out each year. By the end of it, that number jumped to 1,000, a full tenfold increase. That is just incredible growth. So what was going on? What caused this massive boom? Well, it was another perfect storm, really. You had the Industrial Revolution, which brought in new printing technology that made books way, way cheaper. More people were learning to read than ever before. And then came the real game changer, serialization. Authors started publishing their novels one chapter at a time in cheap newspapers. It was like the 19th century version of a weekly TV show drop. People were totally hooked. And all this new popularity created a huge stage for some of the most famous authors in history. These were writers who grabbed this new art form and used it like a mirror to reflect the crazy, fast-paced, changing world all around them. I mean, you had guys like Charles Dickens, who became the equivalent of modern-day rock stars. His stories weren't about kings, they were about poor orphan boys and struggling factory workers. He built entire worlds filled with characters that this huge new middle-class readership could really connect with. When a new Dickens chapter came out, it was the event. You had to read it. But there's another side to this story, a kind of hidden history. Because while the novel was exploding, a lot of its most powerful and groundbreaking voices had to stay in the shadows. Why? Because they were women. And in that era, a woman writing a novel was just not. A woman writing a novel was just not seen as a serious thing. So, to get their work published and taken seriously, they had to hide behind fake male names. You've heard of Currer Bell, who wrote Jane Eyre? That was actually Charlotte Bronte. Ellis Bell, who gave us the unforgettable Wuthering Heights? That was her sister, Emily. And one of the most celebrated novelists of the age, George Eliot, was really a woman named Mary Ann Evans. And these women weren't just writing polite little stories. Oh no, they were tackling huge, controversial issues. Take the youngest Bronte sister, Anne. She wrote a book called